Did you get these? I bought them.
Rob, what's this one?
So as we're all settling into lunch, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Okay, wonderful, wonderful. For those of you that I haven't met, I am Lori O'Connor. I am one of the associate directors at the Center for Urban Education, and I just want to re-welcome you, say how excited we are to have you here, to have all this energy, all these great conversations. And I also have the distinct privilege of getting to introduce, some of you have already heard me introduce her, but getting to introduce Dr. Susi Long. And she is going to be giving our keynote lecture, so don't look like you're enjoying it too much, because she hasn't gotten to eat it yet. But she is going to be talking with us over lunch today. So Dr. Susi Long is a professor in the Department of Instruction and Teacher Education at the University of South Carolina. She came up to us and she was talking about how this is her second time in Pittsburgh, and how she kind of likes it. But Dr. Long's research focuses on culturally relevant and equity pedagogies that challenge and replace unjust practices in elementary and early childhood literacy and teacher education. This is some of the conversation we've been having in the other room this morning. She's the author of numerous books on these topics, and she teaches courses in literacy methods, culturally relevant pedagogies, linguistic pluralism, language acquisition in diverse communities, and critical qualitative methodologies. She was a classroom teacher in kindergarten through 8th grade, a past chair of trustees of the National Council of Teachers Research Foundation, an NCTE Promising Researcher, and the 2013 Early Childhood Education Assembly's Early Literacy Educator of the Year. She also co-founded the Assembly's Professional Dyads and Culturally Relevant Teaching Project, supporting teacher-to-teacher educator partners in generating anti-bias and culturally relevant practices in early childhood. And as I mentioned, we are delighted to have her with us over the next 2 days. So with that, Dr. Long.
Thanks, everybody. I'm really bad with a microphone, but I'll try not to be shy about it. How is everybody? You having a good morning so far?
Yes.
Yes, good. Thank you so much, everybody, for inviting me here to the University of Pittsburgh. So it's just amazing. I feel like I've never been so well taken care of in my life. Everybody has been really, really awesome. So anyway, I'm going to go jump right into this because, as is typical of me, I have way more slides than I have time to talk about. So I will go ahead and get going. What I wanted to talk about today is something that I've been trying to work with teachers in the districts where we live, where we work, and also in our university courses. And I'm really lucky to be able to do it in the company of some awesome, awesome colleagues. Dr. Gloria Boutte, Rich Miller mentioned her book this morning, Educating African American Students and How Are Their Children. Also Dr. Nathaniel Bryan, Dr. Kamanya Winter-Hoyt, Dr. Eliza Braden, and Dr. Mayor Muller. And the 6 of us have formed a collective with schools in our area called an Urban Education Collective. So we're trying to do some things where we do some professional development in the schools, and we place our student teachers there as well. But one of the things that, as I've been working with the teachers, that I've been trying to get better at figuring out how to communicate is basically why Black Lives Matter matters in every classroom. And that also connects really closely with why culturally relevant teaching matters in every classroom. And let me just tell you that I think one of the reasons for that I think is foundational to that is we often think of culturally relevant teaching as being about capturing the cultural relevance of the kids sitting in front of us. But I think it's also really important to remember that there's an important element to culturally relevant teaching that Gloria Ladson-Billings really helps us think about, and that is developing kids' critical consciousness. And so to develop a critical consciousness, you have to really have a lot of experience understanding and appreciating the relevance of those that have been marginalized or omitted from the conversation or degraded in the conversation for centuries. And we see this happening now across the country. So it sadly continues to be a timely period in our history to continue talking about this, and we have such an important responsibility as teachers in schools. So I want to start with, how many of you know a group, it's a poetry group called Sister Outsider? Is anybody familiar with them? So I'm going to play this little clip of Denise Froman, and this is called Accents.
My mom holds her accent like a shotgun with two good hands. Her tongue all brass knuckled, slipping in between her lips. Her hips are all laughter and wind clap. She speaks a sancocho of Spanish and English, pushing up and against one another in rapid fire. There is no telling my mama to be quiet. My mama don't know quiet. Her voice is one size better fit all. And you best not tell her to hush. She waited too many years for her voice to arrive to be told it needed housekeeping. See, English sits in her mouth remixed, so strawberry becomes a strawberry, and cookie becomes a cookie, and kitchen, keychain, and chicken all sound the same. My mother doesn't say yes, she says aha, and suddenly the sky in her mouth becomes a Hector Lavoe song. Her tongue can't lay itself down fat enough for the English language. It got too much hip, too much bone, too much bone, got too much guac on a two-step, got too many piano keys in between her teeth. It got too much clapping, too much hand clap, got too much south side to sit still. It's being an anxious child, wanting to make Play-Doh out of concrete English. Be too neat for her kind of wonderful. Her words spill in conversation between women whose hands are all they got. Sometimes our hands are all we got, and accents that remind us that we are still bomba, still plena. You say hueva, hueva. You say hueva, hueva. And a stranger becomes your hermano. You say dale, dale. And a crowd becomes a family reunion. My mother's tongue is a telegram from her mother, decorated with the coquis of El Campo. So even when her lips can barely stretch themselves around English, her accent is a stubborn compass, always pointing her towards home.
It's pretty awesome. My mama's tongue is a telegram from her mother. Her accent is a stubborn compass, always pointing her toward home. And it's her kind of wonderful. Can you guys hear me? I feel very awkward with this. Denise Froman's accents. So I wanted us to use this as sort of a metaphor as I go through my talk today. The idea about compasses and the beautiful words that Denise Froman shared with us. It's her kind of wonderful. How could we ever create a classroom where every kid's kind of wonderful wasn't front and center, wasn't centered, wasn't positioned as important as every other kid's kind of wonderful? But we do. Think about it for a minute. What are the compasses that point you toward home? Like Denise's mother, they may be languages of our heart and soul, or they may be the family stories we tell, the heritage we cherish, the cultural traditions we embrace, the communities that give us safety and self-worth, the belief systems that sustain us, the histories that show us the way, the people who have come before us. But as we go through today, look at all of those compasses that point us all toward home in some way, and think about where they exist or don't exist for every student in your classrooms and in your schools. What would happen if those compasses were taken away from you? What if those compasses were degraded, dismissed, or ignored? The reality is that many students' compasses, particularly students of color, are denied because their cultural practices, languages, histories, and heritage are left out of or tokenized in the curriculum, while others are normalized. Think about those words. What is tokenized, just a token nod, and what is normalized? This is what we do and talk about every day. Also because their family structures are absent from the accepted norm in classrooms, in instruction, and in teacher attitudes. Oh, well, you know that family, there's no dad. Or you know that family has 2 moms. And because their acts of discrimination are ignored or swept aside when they occur in and out of school. Compasses are also denied when students experience curricular omissions, misrepresentations, and partial histories of people of color and indigenous communities. Now think about your own school and your own classrooms as you look at all these ways that compasses are denied. And think about the kids that are about to greet you when you start back to school in the fall. Think about what it would be like to stand in the middle of your classroom and look around at your students and at the walls of your classroom, at the books on the bookshelves, at the curriculum you're about to teach. Whose compasses dominate and whose compasses are marginalized or not there at all. Compasses are denied when students learn to read using barely diverse or stereotypically diverse books, when they witness more peers of color leaving the room for special education, in contrast to the number of white peers leaving for gifted classes, when they see no LGBTQIA people and families normalized in the books they read or the histories they study, when they observe more negative responses to the behaviors of children of color than white children whose similar behaviors are sometimes ignored or justified, when they discern lower expectations for some and higher expectations for others, when they receive little guidance in being able to recognize injustices and fight against them. We can see this in the curriculum, in our materials, in our texts, in the walls of our classrooms, in our teachers' lounge talk, in our relationships with families and communities. However, my homeward compasses have always been front and center in my school. This is my 4th grade class. In my 4th grade class, I learned whiteness as rightness. My lovely teacher, Mr. Capitano, who we all adored, did not stand there and say, "Susie, you're better than everybody else." But the message came through, even though I probably couldn't have articulated it at that point. But the rightness of whiteness, and whiteness as the discovery of everything that matters in the world, and everything that's been invented in the world, was communicated through the curriculum. We learned about the age of exploration. Nobody ever talked to me about the age of the eradication of peoples, the age of genocide, the age of colonization, which took away people's faiths, languages, dress, cultural customs, land, life. The age of discovery. Nobody ever said, how do you discover something that's already discovered? We didn't learn about Indian boarding schools, or the attempts to whiteify Native Americans, and that happened in Canada and happened in Australia and other countries. Instead, we learned Westward Ho, and we learned about Indians as savages. We learned about African Americans starting with slavery. Instead, we could have started with African governmental structures after which many European governments were structured. We could have learned about African art and music and how it's influenced the world. We could have started with African scientists, novelists, poets, and explorers who reached faraway lands much sooner than Europeans did. We could have started with African mathematicians who gave us the first method of counting, who gave us the first mathematics textbooks, including multiplication, division, and geometry, who gave us the first calculation of distances according to algebraic equations. We could have started with African astronomers and inventors, like the Kenyan construction of a Stonehenge in 300 BC, or the Mali people's detailed astronomical observations, or advances in steam engines and chisels and saws and nails and carbon steel in Tanzania and Rwanda and Uganda, surpassing those of European invention. We learned about slavery as something in the past with no repercussions today. Abraham Lincoln took care of it, it's over. And we could have learned about Jim Crow's ongoing impact on institutions and individuals today. They were left out of the story. I didn't know about Juneteenth until 2 years ago. I'm 64 years old. That's a wow, isn't it? Why didn't I know about it? It was absent in any kind of curriculum I ever was a part of. What did we learn about inventors? We learned about these guys, right? Well, we didn't learn about these people. We learned about explorers who conquered rather than enslaved, stole, gained wealth and control under the guise of bringing civilization to the barbarian. We didn't learn about these explorers. And it's interesting because not only are those figures hidden from our curriculum, but when the stories are told, they're often misrepresented. So how many of you saw Hidden Figures? All right, so do you remember the scene about when, what's the actor's name, the white guy? Yeah, Kevin Costner was pulling down the colored bathroom sign. So you guys know the story. It's the story of the NASA mathematicians, African-American women, who basically put us into space in their mathematical calculations. But there were colored and white bathrooms. And there's a scene in the movie where Kevin Costner pulls down in his great way, pulled down the colored sign. That never happened. It never happened. She simply refused to go to the colored bathroom. So she was the one that took the initiative, that had the courage. But in an article about the movie, they said, well, we felt like there had to be something that the white guy did. You gotta watch that. Think about that in the text you're using with your kids and that you're having them read on the web. Have them triangulate. Go to the horse's mouth. Go to the persons who were involved and find out the story. Artists. I did an art history degree. I learned about a lot of these guys, but not many artists of color. Art activists. Not only did I not learn about the genius of many people other than Europeans and European Americans, I certainly did not learn to develop a critical consciousness about why their stories were missing from the histories. They were missing, but nobody ever sat down to help me develop a critical eye and a critical ear to say whose stories could be missing. How would the story be different if it were told by? Flash forward to my first grade class. That's me standing in the back in Clearwater, Florida. What did I do? I replicated what I'd learned. So another generation, right? I replicated what I had learned, which is really a colonized look at curriculum. So how did this happen? This is a very quick little video, but it gives you an idea over the centuries of colonial takeover. So what do you notice when you see 2008, particularly in terms of Africa? What left? Supposedly independence was gained, right, in many countries. But how many of you have traveled to African countries? So in many countries, the vestiges of colonization still have quite a stronghold. When I was in Sierra Leone a few years ago, the books that children learned from in schools were still British books. African children learn from books with British children, right? The streets are still named by the names of Shakespearean characters or players, whatever they are. So there's still quite a stronghold of colonization that was intended to take away what was indigenous, and successfully did in many ways, which is so long-lasting. So let's think about this a little bit in terms of how our impressions trickle down into our curriculum today. curriculum is what it is today, right? Because it's not too long ago that all of this happened. So when you think about curriculum that was first instituted in colonized countries around the world, what did that have to be? It had to reflect those images that you just saw there, right? Because the European powers had to have some reason to convince people that they were better than, and that the people they were colonizing were less than, right? That needed civilization. People that had civilization. Remember when I showed you about African scientists and mathematicians and astronomers? And so as Europeans come in, all that gets wiped out of the curriculum. And all of a sudden, it's the European contributors of the world that become dominant in the curriculum. So it takes a real movement, and it takes a real effort by teachers to turn that upside down, to create a pedagogical overhaul that's going to create a truer history. Joyce King and Ellen Swartz wrote a wonderful book a couple of years ago called Afrocentric Praxis, and it's about remembering history. And it really helps us think about what do we have to unlearn and then relearn, which is going to take some really wonderful and fascinating investigation on our part as teachers, which would be great to do as study groups in a school. What can we learn about the histories that have been hidden, the histories that we can bring to the forefront? Carmen Tisdale is a teacher I've been working with for a long time, and she and I have done a couple of books together. We're doing a second one together now with her colleague Janice Baines. And she says, had I known more about Africa than the negative views typically portrayed, I would have felt a sense of pride sooner about my heritage. It's almost like we went through a phase of Black pride, but not African pride. I can appreciate, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud, but where did that come from? All I knew in school was about slavery. I think knowing about the richness of my heritage would have made a difference in me. And it would have made a difference in me too. We see this everywhere. And just as an example of this sort of colonized, whiteified view of the world and history, that's my husband, actually, leaving this a year ago at this time. He left on a cross-country solo trip on his motorcycle from South Carolina out to all the national parks and back again. And no, I don't ride on his motorcycle. Anyway, he stopped at a place in near St. Louis, I think. And anyway, there was a place called the Herman Herman, I guess, riverfront, in this little town where he stayed overnight. And he called me and he was telling me this is a German town, everything's German in it. And he said there was a time when Germans who had emigrated to the colonies, I guess, came by barge down, maybe it was the Missouri River, I can't remember, and created this settlement. And they were the first settlers here. That's what everybody's been telling me. I said, Jan, you got to go deeper than that. But there were people there before those Germans came. Who were they? What's the story? So he went into one of the little museums and said, what's the story on who was there before? Oh, well, there were Indians, but they fought and they killed each other and they died out. Talk about distorting history, right? Where are the African Americans? I ended up doing the research on that. Turns out it was a sundown town, and there was an African American community nearby, and in that town, African Americans had to leave before sundown, right? There's so much more than meets the eye. Our monuments, the party line when we go and we take tours of our national heritage sites. You gotta ask the deeper questions. Who was here before? What happened to this? Why is that the primary story? Same thing happened as he was visiting national parks. So tell me the story of whose land was this to begin with? Whose land has this been taken from? What kind of reparations have been given? I was telling the group this morning about some research that one of my doctoral students did. Her name is Erin Miller, and she helps us see this in our daily lives, the whiteness of our daily lives. She is white and has 3 young children, and she studied for 9 months all of the messages they received about race in Sunday school, in their dance lessons, in school, mail that came through the mail slot. She just recorded all of it. And obviously, it was a bombarding of whiteness. And she writes this. She says, normalized whiteness came through church, dance classes, magazines, catalogs, school worksheets, and texts, the images on packages of food, toys in our neighborhood. They received messages about the supremacy of whiteness through an over-representation and the exaltation of white people again and again, quite literally everywhere, sustained by simultaneous messages that conveyed degradation of blackness. Concurrently, there were discourses of omission wherein the perspectives of persons of color were literally void in school curricula, neighborhood newsletters, daily mail, TV shows, songs on the radio, billboards, advertisements, and church meetings. So if you walk the world and you know that you're not represented, that's not unfamiliar. But it is a wake-up call for everybody else to say, why should Black Lives Matter for my white kids in my classroom? Here's 1 billion reasons why. And here were some of the things. That was the Scholastic newsletter. that she did a review of, worksheets, depictions of beauty in women, and depictions on the opposite side of stereotypical persons of color. The little girl at the top is a child who is depicted as, to be pitied, and also you've got to have your requisite Martin Luther King coloring sheet during Black History Month. A rightness of whiteness. Through these experiences, children construct deeply embedded notions that, if not critically challenged and contradicted, are learned as truths, right? That will guide them as they grow up to be our policymakers, our teachers, healthcare providers, law enforcement officers, social workers, members of the justice system, and leaders of nations. We've got a big responsibility as teachers, don't we? The reality is a bitter pill to swallow, particularly when we must acknowledge injustices in our own educational and societal backyards. So I just took some pictures off the internet of a few classrooms. They're pretty, they're colorful, but I don't walk into those classrooms and feel the beauty of the diversity of this country and this globe richly, do I? And there I certainly don't. On the other hand, when classrooms richly embrace our richly diverse societies in normalized, not tokenized ways, we hear things like this. And these are some family members who were talking about Carmen and Janice's classrooms, the teachers I worked with for a while. One parent said, "You can look right in that room and see the diversity from the door on. I can see where a child would say, 'Hey, that looks like me, I'm ready to learn. That person has my best interest in mind.' Or, 'I can have a relationship with that person.' A child could have ownership of this." Another family member said, "In your class, you see all your black heroes, where in your white classes, you see your white heroes. Well, they're white heroes." A lot of classrooms you go to, you just see ABCs and 1, 2, 3s and different things like that. I'm not saying that's not important, but you had our culture where they could understand it. Learning the different thongs, African cultures, and they're seeing these things. So your class was a little bit different from everyone else's, and the kids see that. So what does this have to do with culturally relevant teaching? Everything. So Gloria Ladson-Billings, as you all know, in her Toward a Theory of Culturally Relevant Pedagogy, helps us think about it in terms of 3 tenets. Developing students' expertise, experience, and academic success, developing and maintaining cultural competence, and developing a critical consciousness through which they challenge the status quo of the current social order. I think the third one gets left off a lot. But really, there's no relevant and culturally relevant teaching unless we can first demonstrate that we see every student, family, community, history, and heritage as relevant. So culturally relevant teaching to me also means centering marginalized cultures as normalized just as much as whiteness is in the classroom. So Black Lives Matter and culturally relevant teaching matter for every child because we need to right centuries of curricular wrongs, heritages and histories that have been distorted, marginalized, and omitted from what we teach, which includes helping kids develop a critical consciousness so they recognize the omissions and the degradation and the marginalization and the aggressions. They start pointing it out and helping them know how to take action. Why does this matter so much? First, it matters because we continue to, as Woodson said in 1933, generations of young people who grew up educated in whiteness without the curricular normalization of other ways of being. So we continue to fail underrepresented populations who must struggle to achieve within systems divorced from their own cultural and linguistic norms. And of course, evidence of ongoing discrimination is another reason why we need to think about this. Negative profiling, microaggressions, and the brutality of people of color, immigrants, speakers of languages in addition to English, LGBTQIA people, and so on. Remembering that as teachers, we help to raise new generations who will respond with appreciation and caring to the world around them, or not. So let's just look at the juxtaposition of then and now. the times we thought we were through. 1961 looks an awful lot like 2017. 1939, 2016. 1939, 2017. 1963, 2017. And then incidents like New York Giants player whose home was vandalized. You guys remember this story of Dr. Tamika Cross, who was on the Delta flight. Do you remember that a few months ago? She was not assumed to be the physician that she was when she offered to help. Actually, the attendant said, "Oh no, sweet, you put your hand down. We're looking for actual physicians." And in my own state, we just have had the anniversary of the massacre of 9 amazing human beings. And most recently, in the last few years, you've all been reading about Nabra in Fairfax, Virginia. These are just a few of many, many. And in schools, we've got to look at our text, right? Did you guys remember the story of the geography textbook in Texas last year? That a mom actually put out on social media and wrote to the school because they were calling enslaved people immigrants. This immigrant population. The way discipline is handled. This is also just up the road from me in Columbia, South Carolina. You might know it as the Spring Valley incident. There was a young woman who wouldn't stop talking on her phone, and so they brought the school resource officer who promptly threw her across the room in her chair. I talk about this with my students, my undergraduates, as they're sitting there texting on their phone. Do you remember the story about Ahmed, who brought this amazing block that he had created to school and was actually handcuffed and taken to the police precinct because of the assumption it was a bomb? In Florida, teachers scolded the behavior of black students by saying, "Don't get you sent back to Africa." In Indiana, a 7th grader demanded to know whether a classmate adopted from China was in fact Mexican, because if so, you're going to be killed. In Minnesota, a middle school student's hijab was forcefully removed. In California, every time I read about what's happening with Muslim women and the just horrendous things, I think nobody ever would go up and grab somebody's cross off their neck and pull it off, would they? Never would think about that. But somehow that seems to be okay to somebody. In California, a 13-year-old adopted from Mozambique was told by her classmate, "You're going to have to go back to Africa where you belong." In Michigan, "You're Asian, right? When they see your eyes, they'll send you back." In South Carolina, to a 3rd-generation Vietnamese descent 7-year-old, "You're going to be deported." In Colorado, "Death to diversity" sign on campuses. In Massachusetts, 14-year-old boy riding his bike on the sidewalk by his house. Man walked up yelling, "Hey, N-word, next time get off the bike." In multiple states, students sent home because of hairstyles. In a Michigan high school, one of the students is relaying this. Then you hear what they're saying, and then they're beating their hands against the table, she said, and it got louder and louder. "Build a wall, build a wall." You look around and half the cafeteria is doing it. The kids, they seemed to be so happy and excited they were saying this, and it was hurtful. It was so hard to look and just watch and not be able to do anything because I was afraid. I was so scared. I had people making jokes about me and my culture. They made jokes about Mexicans. They made jokes about blacks. It's disheartening and it hurts me physically. The day of the Build a Wall chant, a student called Isabel Taco. I started to cry again from that moment. Within 3 days after the 2016 election, we saw numerous hate incidents. And the significant thing is, look at how many were in K-12 settings. A large majority were in K-12 settings and university settings. The bottom line is, our teaching can promote such acts or explicitly teach against them through culturally relevant teaching that lets every student know that every other student and his or her history, language, religion, family structure, etc., are valued. And although these acts have been emboldened, we know that they are not new occurrences. And we know they're also experienced in more subtle and insidious ways in schools, often overlooked except by those victimized by them. This is a paragraph that comes out of something that Janice and Carmen and I have been working on, and we're drawing from Bettina Love, who draws from legal scholar Williams to describe parallels between the violence against black bodies in society to the what she calls, and he called, spirit murdering of black children in schools, which often goes unnoticed, even in a time when folks are screaming in the streets that Black Lives Matter. So then we write, spirits are murdered in many ways. For example, when students of color are dehumanized and criminalized through punishments for low-level behaviors, far more than white students. When racist and xenophobic chants, black boys and girls expelled and suspended at much higher rates than their white counterparts for the same or lesser infractions, lowered academic expectations for African American students, and as outlined earlier, when students' histories and heritage are missing from or misrepresented in the curriculum. This means that every teacher has a moral responsibility to ask, how does a black child live, learn, and grow when her spirit is under attack at school and her body is in danger outside the classroom? And those words come from Bettina Love. So when we say Black Lives Matter, and this comes from, and I'm sure you recognize the originators of Black Lives Matter. They say when we say Black Lives Matter, we're broadening the conversation around state violence to include all the ways in which black people are intentionally left powerless in the hands of the state. We're talking about the ways in which black lives are deprived of our basic human rights and dignity. So we just have to think about, how is that denied in schools? I wanted to draw on my friend and colleague Valerie Kinlock, who is going to be the new dean here at the University of Pittsburgh and the College of Ed. But she writes, maintenance of the status quo comes at the expense of the lives, literacies, and languages of black students and other students of color, many of whom are regularly criminalized inside classrooms and assaulted within their own communities. Teachers and researchers have no choice but to delve deeply into and expand on meanings of cultural relevance and responsiveness if the languages and literacies of youth of color are to be sustained. That's it in a nutshell, isn't it? She says that so beautifully. So we remember that schooling is one way we can renormalize whiteness. It becomes an ingrained truth. But there is hope. As intentionally as injustices were put in place, they can be intentionally taken down. Recognizing them and taking responsibility for working to disrupt and dismantle them is a first step. Teachers in particular, we're perfectly positioned to take this step. In fact, we accept this responsibility when we choose to educate children who will one day make the decisions that guide every institution and interaction in our society. Because of our teaching, children will or will not build understandings that know race, ethnicity, language, religion, gender identification, economic situation, or sexual orientation holds more virtue than any other. Children will or will not learn that their racial and ethnic histories, heritages, and language hold great value in the world. They will or will not receive an education that recognizes their worth, ability, and potential, building on resources they bring to the classroom. They will or will not learn to recognize discrimination, silencing, and marginalization, as well as strategies for working against those practices. This is culturally relevant teaching in its truest form. For all teachers, acknowledging and challenging these realities is a necessary entry point into successful culturally relevant teaching. At the same time, we know it's tough to realize these realities if you aren't victims of them yourself. Consider this. This comes from Adrienne Rich. When someone with the authority of a teacher, say, describes the world and you're not in it, there's a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked in the mirror and saw nothing. So I've altered that a little bit to say, when someone with the authority of a teacher, say, describes the world and you are dominant in it, you come away internalizing that you matter more and those around you matter less. A parent in Carmen's classroom said to her, you know, pride is something. You stick out your chest when you have pride. Knowing that your people have done so much, it makes you feel proud. And knowing that you see me as doing something makes me feel proud too. So while never neglecting other forms of discrimination, right now we're losing Black bodies literally and figuratively in society and classrooms across the country every day. As educators, we can't claim to stand for humanity. In fact, we contribute to dehumanization if we do not actively affirm and teach our students to affirm cultural, linguistic, and literate pluralism. And that comes from Django Paris and Samuel Leem's new book about culturally sustaining pedagogy that you'll want to get a hold of too. When even one person or group of people is marginalized, inaccurately depicted, tokenized, or invisibilized through our practices, humanity is withheld for all students as they watch and they listen and they absorb and they take away and then they perpetuate their lessons about who matters. I'm reminded of how much Black Lives Matter matters for all of us when I think about the microaggressions I commit because of that deeply embedded, colonized learning that has to be consciously fought every day. For example, when I wasn't alert enough to know how to talk to white administrators about the great wrong they were doing, firing a colleague because of parental backlash against racist conversations in the classroom. Or when I assumed that one of my students' husband was a custodian. When I repeatedly mixed up the names of 2 Latino colleagues. When I railed in my classes about not pronouncing children's names correctly and then didn't take the time to do so with my own students. When I told university students that I had high expectations by telling them I'm going to crack the whip. When I deferred to white students while overlooking the sole African American students sitting back in the class. I share these examples to remind us to take a breath and to commit to the ongoing examination of ourselves and our institutions. We can't be culturally relevant teachers without it. It comes with the territory. You know, Solange talked about ensuring that everyone has a seat at the table. But you know, in actuality, we need a table. And you're here to build it in the company of awesome and joyful and caring colleagues. Because you know what? It's our profound privilege, opportunity, and responsibility as teachers to do as Carmen says, teach on the right side of change. Like Rich did this morning, I put up some of my favorite books I thought you might like. The one on the far left is Valerie Kinloch's Harlem on Our Minds, a beautiful story about high school students that she worked with in Harlem, talking about the gentrification of Harlem. In the middle is Gloria Boutiz educating African American students that we've talked about, and Rich's Racing to Class. I love that chapter on pre-service teachers too. I like using that in faculty. Multiplication is for white people. I talked about that this morning. The one in the middle is Joyce King and Ellen Swartz's Afrocentric practice of teaching for freedom, and you probably know Gloria Lassen-Billings' classic Dream Keepers. So we get back to the compasses. As we make the compasses that are too often left out, marginalized or tokenized or degraded, central to our teaching every day, we think about how what we do in classrooms has an impact on raising new generations who will know, appreciate, support, and protect each other's heritage, languages, beauty, brilliance, and right to be who they are. In the words of the National Council of Teachers of English Early Childhood Assembly, we're the people who help raise generations of future adults who will feel safe in who they are and know how to stand up for others and challenge injustices in their place of work, education, worship, neighborhoods, and communities, or not. What we do matters. Black Lives Matter, no matter the demographic of our classmates.
And before we head back to our breakout rooms, we'll be going back to the room we were in this morning, either in here with Dr. Husband or in the room across the way with Dr. Long. We want to give you a special thank you. We appreciate all that you've done so far and all that you're doing in the community.